emeriti faculty or just faculty who have fewer meetings to go to. So I know that you're still going to be very engaged and active in this. I want to talk today about American democracy. Thanks so much, Peter. And American democracy used to be something that we could all take for granted, right? We would look down from our city on the hill at the rest of the world and ask whether their democracies would survive. We'd send our election observers out to elections to see if they were free and fair and stable. But really the last several years, I think, have punctured our sense of self-satisfaction and that sense that American democracy will necessarily be stable, and we don't have to worry about democratic erosion on our shores. We've seen changes in the world, and academics have chronicled that, including many people at UC San Diego. So Barb Walters, her book, How Civil Wars Start, talks about the potential for civil wars in the United States, not a battlefield with blue and gray, but sort of skirmishes resembling the troubles in Northern Ireland that could spread around the country, especially after critical elections. And in many ways, we've seen troubling signs that something like the troubles are upon us. So January 6th was the most obvious example of this, but even after the relatively calm and non-controversial 2022 elections, we had, for instance, a losing candidate in New Mexico who paid 4 men to shoot up the houses of 2 county supervisors and 2 state legislators. And we see election officials across the country facing threats that these formerly obscure bureaucrats never had to worry about. So in a study done by the Democracy Forum last year, found that 1 in 4 election officials. So these are the county registrars, the elections clerks, usually civil servants who are just in charge of printing up ballots and making sure that the polls are open to everyone. 1 in 4 has faced threats. And if you get to the big cities, that's 2/3 of these election officials facing threats. At a recent conference of secretaries of state, one arrived with her own security detail, another was having surveillance cameras installed in their home, and all across the country, we've seen the FBI arresting people for threatening elections officials. So one of the things that we've tried to do at UC San Diego is work directly with these people who are the front lines of democracy, these nonpartisan election officials in states across the country who are in charge of running elections, but now have this second duty added to their really demanding job. And that second duty is essentially convincing people to trust American elections. Because if our democracy is going to erode, it's because people are not going to see elections as free and fair, and they're not going to be sure that their vote will be counted correctly or the votes of others will be counted correctly. And so what I want to share with you today are the results from some studies that I've done with a team of scholars. So Jen Gadet and Mac Lockhart are fabulous grad students here at UCSD. Seth Hill is my colleague, and Mindy Romero runs the Center for Inclusive Democracy at USC. And what we've been doing is partnering with elections officials to find out what they want to know about the public that they serve, what they trust, whether they trust elections, what they do and don't trust about elections, where the concerns are among voters. And then we want to be looking at potential sources of democratic resilience, solutions to this problem of a lack of trust in elections. What is it that's going to actually restore trust in elections, especially on a bipartisan basis, that could help put our democracy back on firmer ground? So this project is part of a long-term trying to advance this. Maybe this will work. All right. If someone might help me advance any of these slides. Let's see. Oh, there we go. Now I'm free. Okay, excellent. So as part of a long-term project that I've been working on with scholars across the University of California system, where we were working on looking at voter reforms in California and what their impact was. And then we had surveys that were about to go out into the field in the spring of 2020, just when our elections were massively upended by the COVID-19 pandemic. And that pandemic left Americans of all partisan stripes with a lot of questions about elections, right? Because we had to change from voting primarily in person as a nation to voting by mail. This is something that Californians have been familiar with for a long time, but across the country in many places, and voters in places like Oregon, Washington, Colorado, Nevada had been doing it, but in much of the nation's eastern seaboard, and in particular in many of the battleground states, we hadn't been voting by mail. So this was a new process that people had legitimate questions about. And we did a series of polls during the course of that election. And what they showed was in April of 2020, there was really hardly any partisan split over voting, support for voting by mail and whether people wanted to cast a ballot by mail. And that split really changed. We did a series of 4 polls, and what happened was we just saw whenever Donald Trump would talk about voting by mail as a source of election fraud, we would see that gap between Republicans and Democrats go further and further to being more than 20 percentage points at the end of the election. So what we really saw was leaders in one party raising questions about a new way of voting, and voters not having answers to those questions, and thus relying on the leaders that they trusted, right? Which is an understandable reaction of human nature. And this culminated with, after the 2020 election, the long and ongoing accusations, completely unfounded, right? But made over and over again by Donald Trump and many Republican allies who've gone along with that. And that has led to this gap in trust between the parties. And that gap in trust between the parties is actually very different than the gap in trust in elections that we had on the eve of the 2020 election. So where were we going into the 2020 election in trusting elections in America? So this is a question. Let me see if I can minimize or move this Zoom. Oops, sorry, this Zoom screen so that you can see the top of this. Sorry. Sorry, if anyone could give me a little hand in just moving this out of the way. Well, but the title of this, thanks very much. This is a question that says, do you trust the US democratic system in general? This is data. Okay, thanks so much. Generally speaking, how much do you trust the United States election system? This is data not from our study, but from a polling group called the Morning Consult that has been doing a long-term time series on this. And where were we on the eve of 2020? We were at a time when 65% of Republicans trusted elections, but only 48% of Democrats and 44% of independents, who are the Republicans in red, Democrats in blue, independents in green line. Right? Democrats, what were they worried about? It was about Russian influence in the 2016 elections. Democrats became less trusting, and so you see this, about 18% gap between the two parties, 17% gap between the two parties in trust in elections, and that flips overnight after the 2020 election and the claims by Donald Trump about how you shouldn't trust them. And so Republicans become the group that doesn't trust elections. Democrats become the group that does trust elections. It becomes an article of faith now in the Democratic Party, one of the things that divides the two parties. And independents are down where Republicans are. So that's when our surveys, when our current series of surveys started, which is in which we feel that after the midterm elections were called in November of 2022. When we were looking at this, the question was, would this non-controversial election that seemed to go smoothly without major controversies, was that going to restore trust in American elections? And the headline that we were seeing, and you may have seen in some other surveys, was yes, trust in election was restored because the overall aggregate level of trust averaged across all Americans rose after the 2022 election. What we found from our national survey of more than 3,000 Americans that we designed in collaboration with the elections directors of Texas, Colorado, Georgia, and the registrar in Los Angeles County. What we found was this: trust in election rose for Democrats by about 20 percentage points, rose significantly for independents, but for Republicans, if anything, it fell. So overall, trust rebounded, but the gap between the parties now is larger than it's ever been since we've been polling on this question. If you go specifically to the question of, do you trust that the 2022 midterm results accurately reflected the vote, or do you think there's significant fraud? Overall, right, the public by an almost 3-to-1 margin agrees that these were accurate results. But among Democrats, that's 85-8. Among Republicans, more people, 43%, say that these results are based on significant fraud, than 39% who agree that they accurately reflect the vote. So there are two different visions of reality. And trust in elections now looks like any other really controversial policy issue that divides the parties, like abortion rights, right? It is now one of the dividing lines in our polarized America, at least for the present. Although what these results show to you is that election results are a big determinant of trust. We have this thing called the winner effect. It's true in America in the last 50 years. It's true in nearly every other democracy, which is when your side wins an election, you become more trusting in elections, right? And so for many, one of the questions is, well, if the Republican Party wins the next election, will that trust rebound? Or has there been so much groundwork laid by accusations of mistrust that we won't see that winner effect? All right. There's a clear divide along partisan lines with independents in the middle between the parties. And there's some other divides that emerge. One divide that isn't there is based on gender. There's no gender gap in trust in elections. There's a gender gap in just about everything else in American politics. By about 5 to 10 percentage points, there's no gender gap in trust in elections. There is a gap on racial and ethnic grounds, with white Americans being the least trusting group of elections, but very similar to that is the Latino community in the nation as a whole. Black voters, and you can't see this, but 74% of Asian American voters trust elections. So there is a racial component, and I'm going to be working with graduate students in our program this summer, and including, so we have a summer program that we bring students from Spelman and Morehouse College. And so we're going to have one Morehouse student, one former Spelman student who's now in our PhD program, and another graduate student in our program. And we're going to be exploring the racial and ethnic component to trust in elections in America. One of the other gaps, and the one that is most predictive of trust in elections, is education. Right. So if you look at people who haven't advanced past high school, 43% have trust elections, 26% say there's fraud. And at every other level, once you get to high school or some college, it bumps up by another 10 or 15 percentage points, bumps up another 10 for college graduates. And then people like you, people with the higher degrees, 74% trust elections. And so this is correlated with other divides in American society, but it also raises the question of perhaps what we really need, perhaps the antidote to mistrust is education. Perhaps what we need to do is fill in the blanks, some of those question marks that I showed you on that first graph, some of these just concerns about just the lack of knowledge about how elections work, right? Until the 2020 Bush v. Gore election, did any of you know that Chads could hang? Did any of you know what a Harris vote-o-matic was? Right? I didn't, right? And until this election, I didn't pay much attention to Dominion voting machines and how they operated and how secure they were. And so this opens up an opportunity to give voters information, to then see whether they can take that information and use it to decide for themselves whether they want to trust elections and whether they put up partisan screens to that, right? It could be possible that everyone would change when you get more information. It could be possible that no one will change their mind when exposed to information, or it could be that only people whose partisan worldview is open to it may increase their trust, right? There's a lot of evidence in other realms of what we call motivated reasoning, that when you give the same set of facts to people in two parties, people interpret them through the lens of their party. They believe what they want to believe based on their ideological priors. And if that's the case, then educating people and giving them more information about elections should only increase trust among Democrats and perhaps in left-leaning independents, but not among Republicans. So those are potential limits that we know from other studies in political science on the possibility of sort of educating people towards trust. Before I get to the experiment about how we did that, I want to just show you a few other findings from our survey. What do people distrust about elections? So if you look at, it's really the Republicans who are worried about trust in elections. So let's look down that middle column. And what you see is a few key areas right in the middle there that about half of Republicans and about a third of independents mistrust, right? People are worried about ballots cast by mail. It's been the focus of a lot of what Donald Trump and his allies have talked about. And in some ways, that's what people were that's what's most new in the post-COVID world, is this increased use in voting by mail. People are worried that ineligible voters, whether ineligible voters are actually stopped from casting ballots. This is the concern you see over and over again. When we ask about this in open-ended questions, people are saying, folks who shouldn't be voting are voting. That's tied up a lot, frankly, in people's views on illegal immigration and what's happening in the United States and changes to what people view as traditional demographics of the United States. Right, and it's clearly a flashpoint of concern for Republicans, and also they're worried that people are casting more than one ballot. Right, that this sort of old school version of vote fraud, of voting early and often, doing something which is both. It's like the worst paying felony in American society. Right, hardly, as lots of political science evidence shows, your chances of being pivotal are infinitesimally small in any election, and yet it's a felony to vote more than once. Why would you do it? We have lots of evidence that it doesn't happen very often, but more than about half of Republicans are concerned that it's happening. The thing that most concerns Democrats is worrying that eligible voters face obstacles to actually registering and casting their ballots. So they're worried about voting rights, but Republicans are even more concerned. So essentially, Republicans are concerned about just about everything, and Democrats about just about nothing, and it's really mail ballot voting and people casting multiple ballots. That's the big area of worry. Another thing, and this came from the suggestion of one of our state elections directors who said, people trust elections in my state. What they don't trust is what's going on in another state. One of the distinctive features of the American election system is we don't have a national election commission that runs everything in a uniform way across the country, as many other nations do. Constitution gives state legislatures authority over the time, place, and manner of elections. States often then devolve power to local governments that run elections in very different ways. What else does the American system of federalism lead to? Well, we've also seen over the last decade, especially, red states moving in one way with policies, blue states moving in another way with policies. And so as these states diverge in both their traditional policies and in their election laws, why would we expect anyone from a place like California to trust the way that Texas runs their elections? Why would we expect Texans to trust the way Californians run their elections? These states are moving in different directions. Their governors are always, having Twitter wars with each other. And so it's kind of natural that people wouldn't trust elections in other states. So what we found was that for each partisan group, right, even though they're starting at different baselines, the level of trust in other states is about 20 percentage points lower than the level of trust for how elections run in your own states, right? 63% of Republicans actually trust their own state's elections, but only 41% trust it in another state. People similarly are pretty confident their own ballot will be counted out. What they're worried about is other people's ballots. Either will be cast but won't be counted, or they'll be allowing people who shouldn't be voting to vote. Now that doesn't stop people from turning out. A supermajority of people who distrust elections, some or a lot, actually do turn out to vote, and I think that's because they think that their vote will be cast and they want it to count against the other votes potentially fraudulent that they think are coming into the system. It's lower than the turnout rate among people who trust elections a lot, but it's still far above zero. So even though people are worried about the system, they're still participating in it. And that may show that there really is kind of a wellspring of support for elections in America. People are still taking part in them. People haven't abandoned them. Democracy is still a broadly participatory activity. And it shows, again, that there is the potential to restore that trust. So before I open it up for questions, I want to talk about a series of experiments we did both in this national survey and then also in samples of between 12 and 1,400 individuals that we polled in each of the states where we partnered with an elections official. So what we wanted to do was, we spent the summer talking to these election officials about what they're doing. And they said they're producing videos where they're trying to invite everyone they can into their elections office to show them how elections work. And they're creating videos where they're taking tours of their elections office, walking people around the floor and saying, look, these are voting machines. They're not connected to the internet. Look, no cords, right? They're explaining how post-election audits work. They're explaining the signature verification checks that secure vote by mail ballots. They're giving people the under the hood view of American elections in order to fill an information gap that other people will be filling on social media. Some of their ads take different approaches. They bring bipartisan messaging where they bring, I'm a Secretary of State, I'm a Democrat, the past Secretary of State was a Republican, we're both going to say you can trust elections. Some of them have just show you and introduce you to who these registrars and county clerks are all across the state. There's one from Virginia called Democracy Defended that shows, the flag waving and it plays patriotic music. And it just shows you pictures of all these elections clerks, getting into their pickup trucks, going through their white picket fences into their houses to show that they're normal people. And so either through these kind of emotional messages, election officials are just like us and you can trust them, or these informational messages, here's how everything works and that's why you can trust it. Election officials were putting significant efforts into getting people to try to trust the 2022 election messages. So what we do is we ran something called a survey experiment. We had samples of this size in each of these states. And what we would do essentially is this. We'll show people, a third of the people randomly selected will get to see something like Democracy Defended, that Virginia ad. Let me see if I can even play it. Oh, wow.
The founding story of this great country is also the story of Virginia, because the American ideals we share today were born right here. So democracy is more than just our way of life.
So that is a slick, well-done ad by a professional media company. What was going on in Maricopa County, which became the sort of ground zero for election controversies in 2022, was actually what we see much more typically, which is kind of a charmingly amateurish video to just give the information.
In Arizona, voters use paper ballots to cast their votes. The tabulators are the machines that the Maricopa County Election Department.
All right, so that's kind of the informational message. The first one was the emotional message. And a third of the people randomly selected on our survey watch Arizona. A third of them randomly selected watch Virginia. And a third of them randomly selected watch Jake from State Farm. And so the idea then is you can compare the levels of trust when we ask people about trust after those surveys, after watching those ads, and see whether, and if you see different levels of trust after they've been given these messages, we know that it was due to the exposure to that advertisement. We can say, here's a causal effect of this. And we can say, look, if we can show this can provide rigorous evidence that this public information campaign can help restore trust in elections. And it's evidence that then these election officials can use and take back to their state legislatures and their governors to say, hey, let's invest in more of this in the 2024 election cycle. What did we find? I'm going to show you sort of the estimated effects of each of these on, we asked a couple questions about specific types of fraud, but our two key questions are the ones in the middle about, do you trust elections in your own state more? How much do you trust elections in your own state? And how much do you trust elections in other states? Our national audience was watching these ads about other states. So we expect change in trust in other states. And then I'll show you a second experiment where we provide in-state messages, information, to Texans about Texan elections, and we see whether that affects trust in their own state. So what do we see? We saw. Okay. There we go. If you look at the Virginia ad on the left, the Arizona ad on the right, if you look at that third line, how much do you trust other states' elections? You see significant increases in trust. So these are about 2 to 3 percentage points in the change in the number of people who said they trusted elections, some or a lot, after watching each of these. And they became more trusting that officials do not engage in vote fraud. Didn't change what people thought about other states, but it wasn't designed to, didn't about their own state, but it was designed to increase trust in other states. And in each state, we did work with state officials to determine what were some messages in your own state. And I'll give you the short answer, which is in each of these states, we found at least one of the messages led people to trust their own state's elections. Didn't change their trust in other states' elections, but learning about your own state's elections and those protections led to an increase in trust. These state effects were much larger, 6 to 13 percentage points, just from watching a single ad. And the most encouraging thing about our findings was, remember that question I'd set up before about, can this actually break through partisan blinders, right? Or is it just going to be Democrats who respond? What we found in each and every state, as well as in our national sample, is equivalent effects between the two parties and among independents. So basically, everyone rose together. It was what we call persuasion in parallel, right? Even though Republicans, didn't catch up to the levels of trust for Democrats after watching just one ad, they moved up and became more trusting in just the same way the Democrats would do, showing, I think, that people are open to being educated and learning more. The other thing that we found is, and it's not quite as rigorous because there are a lot of differences between these ads, but in general, the ads that were most focused on informational efforts, informational approaches, more compelling than the ones focused on just emotions or saying just believe us. So it's really, as you told voters more about elections, they become more trusting regardless of party. So where does this leave us? Well, we've been at UCSD as part of a group of faculty across different schools and departments. So we have our group at the Yankelovich Center doing this research, very closely tied to a new initiative called the Future of Democracy Initiative, which is based out of the IGCC that Peter used to lead, and it's led by a political scientist, Christina Snyder, in our department, and a political scientist, Emily Hafner-Burton, at the School of GPS. We work together to host a national conference of election officials, scholars, and nonprofit leaders looking at defending democracy on our campus. We shared this with there are 4 secretaries of states in attendance. We share these results with them, as well as elections directors. They're taking it back to their national meetings. The partners who in Texas took this to their office, using it as potential justification for more funding. So we're trying to put rigorous data in the hands of the people at the front lines of democracy. And we're trying to then learn from these findings, as well as the election official partners in trying to attack that question of getting people to trust elections in other states. Because when we get to 2024, Californians, what's going to matter is whether we trust the results in Michigan and Wisconsin and Pennsylvania. And it's going to matter whether Texans trust those battleground states. So, and our states are probably not going to have nail-bitingly close elections. It's those purple states where we need to learn about their elections and we need to trust their elections. And so what we're doing is a second round of studies that we're going to put into the field in a couple of weeks that are designed to see whether ads about California elections can cause Texans and Georgians to trust even our blue states elections, and whether information about Texas elections can cause Californians and Coloradans to trust those red state elections, and nationally, whether people put up, whether people's party ID changes their trust in another state's types of elections. So that's what we're working on all across UCSD, and I'm looking forward to our conversation about it. All right, Barbara.
Level of trust if you do the survey on election officials?
Oh, do they not trust each other?
Do they trust themselves and
Yeah.
and their group? Do they trust others? Can you just repeat the question?
Okay, great. So Barbara Parker's question, which is, what is the level of trust among election officials in results? So we did not survey them systematically. So I'm going to just talk from the conversations I've had with them. So very few, every election official sort of knows this fundamental reality that I think most people like working elections have not learned about, which is there's always something that goes wrong. It's, it's always a logistical innocent error, but there are always some problems, right? At UCSD, our polling places had 3-hour lines on election day. Like there's always some issue, right? But they all know and they have trust in each other, that they are all doing their best, resolving those. There are systems in place to guarantee that anyone standing in line gets the right to vote. There's systems in place to make sure that if your ballots, if you didn't get a paper ballot that was read by a machine in Maricopa County, you're allowed to catch it. So they have a lot of trust in those safeguards of those systems to catch and rectify any of those innocent mistakes. That's the case among sort of long-term professionals in this. One of the most worrying things that we're starting to see emerging is some registrars. And remember, when we run these things by county, we're talking a lot of people who, maybe have high school educations, who don't have a lot of resources, who haven't undergone as much training as they would like running elections in certain county. So one, Tina Peters, the elections director, the elections clerk of Mesa County, Colorado, was just indicted on 10 counts by a grand jury for essentially for opening up her Dominion voting machine to election conspiracy theorists, posting that password, allowing the passwords to become posted online. So this sort of internal attack, right, is a worry. Election officials that I talked to are less worried about that happening among election officials themselves as they are by the politicians who oversee them. County boards of supervisors. So there are 3 counties in Colorado that now have boards of supervisors who wanted to move to hand counting of election results, which is very inefficient and can often be much less accurate than machine counting. The County Board of Supervisors wants to do this in Shasta County, California, over the objections of their election clerk. And so their concern is that as questioning the results of the 2020 election becomes a litmus test for moving into office in the Republican Party in some areas of the country, people are worried, those election officials are worried that at the county level and at the state level, they may be overridden by political actors who don't trust elections or find it strategically useful to question elections. Great question. Yeah.
So do you think the Fox Dominion case, the fact that Dominion Article 1 would affect people's trust in those machines? Like, do you think will affect it?
Yeah. So I think clearly it will create a liability concern for major news media organizations before Fox or another major news organization would sort of give a green light to a long-term series of news stories not based in fact. That I think it effectively wards that off. But that's not how people are getting their information especially about a lot of these, right? They're happening in smaller social media communities and in media organizations that don't have the same liability concerns. And so I think we're still going to see stories, and those stories are still going to be amplified on social media. You can't censor those. You can't effectively get them out there. What you can do is inoculate people against them with good information, right? I think is what most people think. We were considering, one of my ideas was, why don't we just do an experiment where we expose some people to Tucker Carlson's tweets or Sidney Powell's tweets about saying, or Sidney Powell's court cases where she was saying like, no reasonable person would have believed me. And I think that's not like what we kind of decided at the end of the day against that, because what we want to do is put sort of news you can use in the hands of election officials. And I don't think any of them are going to have a public information campaign based on that, but it might have had some effect. And Peter, feel free to pull the hook on me whenever we get close to 2 o'clock. Okay, all right. Yes, sir.
Even one of the polls students show,
Uh-huh.
young people voting. And you say that also higher education.
Yeah, so voting, I'll have to go check out that poster. So turnout rates among young voters, well, always lower than people in 65 plus or in 45 to 64 category. It's always lower. It fluctuates radically between elections and based on sort of local conditions and whether people can convince them that what's going on really matters in their lives. So presidential elections have relatively high turnout among young voters, and we saw that in 2020 with this high turnout across the board, including with young voters in San Diego. So like at UC San Diego, there's a really nice study. There's a group at Tufts University that goes basically turnout across each college campus everywhere in the country, and they do reports on these. In 2014, we had one of the lowest turnouts across the country. 2018, UCSD had among the highest, over 70% turnout of UCSD students in that election. And what was going on? Well, you had a battleground congressional district, Mike Levin's 49th, that was in this area, and they hired lots of students to work for him, and they convinced students that there were stakes in this election, right? And so I think that shows in many ways, right, that young voters, whether they're in college or not, right, are going to turn out when they see an election mattering for them and when they feel like they have a pivotal voice in that. And so I think that will lead to this important form of turnout. Yeah, Peter.
Yeah,
Maybe on Zoom.
Oh, yeah, great question. There's something in the chat. Okay. Oh, that was.
I'll ask the question while you're looking.
Mhm.
The way to the last question is that a lot of the questions we were asking what people's belief in the election seem to have no particular content of the issues connected to them. But your answer to the previous question immediately went to when people felt they had a stake. Participation went high up. When you raise the question of the state, it relates to the context. It's related to history somehow. And I wonder what your thoughts are on that. To what extent the trust is a substitute. I'm always confused by trust because trust as a word doesn't say anything about content. It's the lack of trust has to do with your opinion of content. And if you phrase the question in terms of what people think about the state, how does that affect the sense of trust?
Yeah, I think, a kind of larger version of this. So I think, what I heard in the question was, I was talking about the stakes of an election, policy stakes of an election being the key to turnout among young voters. But policy stakes were not it was not the basis of trust in elections. And I think these are sort of two different phenomena, right? Turnout and engagement is one thing and trust is another. Now, they happen to be correlated, but not all that strongly, right? And that data that I showed that that 66% of people who say they don't trust elections still turn out to vote in them shows the limits of trust as something that will perfectly predict behavior. Right. And so one of the questions that, when I've been talking to other, people, whether they're scholars or sort of normal people about what I'm working on now, right? We're not normal people, many dimensions, but it's good. Okay, well, so what does trust matter? Why are we doing this? Why is it important? And one of the answers is, well, we're doing in our new set of surveys, sort of a whole set of questions to look at other behaviors that, if you trust, after you watch one of these campaign advertisements, are you more likely to sign up to work as a poll worker? Are you more likely to, expect your candidates in your party to sign a pledge to accept the results no matter what the outcome, right? Are you going to hold people accountable for these things? Are you, I'd be interested to see what people's thoughts are on how January 6th, people are convicted in January 6th, how strongly they should be punished. So I think it could lead to a whole set of other behaviors or attitudes that even if you're not directly, participating or not participating in elections, you're engaging in the sort of shared set of beliefs and shared set of behaviors that we need to have to sustain democracy, right? Where we have to say, well, we're going to punish those who fall outside its bound. We're going to help administer democracy by serving as poll workers, and we're going to expect that the losers consent to elections even if they lost. Like that full suite of opinions and behaviors, I think, is what's going to be sort of sustaining for democracy in the long term. Tim.
Can the fact that you've identified being misused say, I'm going to increase trust even though I'm doing something that's kind of nefarious or kind of undermine trust, bringing in cyber ninjas or whatever, saying, putting out a commercial that wraps it all in flags. It's wonderful. Is that the mechanism? The mechanism kind of flags and the big offenses, or is the mechanism real information?
Yeah, I mean, so we're trying to be really rigorous about this, and there's no perfect way to have. What you'd like to have is like two advertisements that were alike in all ways, except one of them provided information and the other affected emotions, right? And it's really hard to do that. There are other differences between them, but our sort of, what we seem to show is that in general, those informational messages are more effective than the trust elections. But the example you raised, right, of cyber ninjas. So this was a post-election audit firm, an audit commissioned by the Arizona State Legislature by a group that had no expertise in auditing, that did things in a completely biased way, and still, by the way, showed that their elections were in fact won by the candidates who were declared to have won them. So you could show information that could, you could have an official source. I think what it does show is an official source could indeed provide information, and that information will affect people's attitudes. I think where we are now, and so that can open up the door to sort of misplaced trust, right? But I think where we are now is we know that there's a vast amount of information out that's completely wrong, right? It's absolute misinformation. And that is filling in gaps that are left by this vacuum in knowing how elections work under the hood. And so having that and showing and incentivizing and supporting election directors in their in this project of explaining to voters how elections work will be the best thing to ward off both complete misinformation from non-official sources or potentially misleading information from official sources. If you know that there's already a post-election audit done by the normal civil servants, you might be less likely to trust the election ninjas on it. Yes, sir.
So you show that people's attitudes are remarkably plastic over the short term.
Yeah.
If you show them the right message.
Yeah.
Aren't you worried that those players that have investment in fostering distrust in elections are now going to start, okay, it's going to become a battle of advertisements between those that say trust elections and those that say just trust elections?
Well, I think you're absolutely right, but I think currently it's a battle that's only being played on by one side. Right. And the number of hits when we go to find these things on YouTube, these things have been watched by fewer people than some of my UCSD TV shows. Right. Which is saying a lot or a little. Right. And they need to be amplified and they need to be more. Thanks.
We all watch your TV shows.
Yeah.
Thanks very much, Dad. I really appreciate it. Okay, everybody, that concludes our program, and thank you all very much. We've had a very fine year, and I look forward to the next year with all of you, with me as president, Barbara as vice president, and the rest of the team who is here. Thanks very much. Have a good year.
I'll bring back gavel to future meetings. And you can.
But these are yours. Here. I don't want to take it. Okay, thanks very much.
No,
Tanya.
thank you.
We got